Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for a Tax Practitioners Board webinar. My name is Ashley Dowsard, and I'm joining you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. I'd like to pay my respect to them and their cultures and elders past and present. To begin, I have a few housekeeping messages. First, to obtain a copy of today's slides, you can visit our webinar resources hub at tpb.gov.au/webinar-hub. We'll also email you a copy of the slides. Today's webinar counts towards your continuing professional education or CPE, and you can claim 1 hour for attending. In relation to claiming your CPE, we will issue an attendance certificate to those of you staying online for the duration of the webinar. Today, we'll look at the new Code of Professional Conduct obligations. We'll discuss the reasons why there are new obligations, the government's transitional arrangements, our consultation process, the new requirements relating to competency and quality management systems, and we'll finish off with a panel discussion and answer your questions. We also have Nadia and Tariq from our policy and legislation team to respond to your questions as we go. So please submit them using the Q&A. We have a lot of people online today, so we may not get to all your questions. However, we will have FAQs available on our website following the webinar. Also, a reminder to keep your comments courteous and professional. We will also be turning off the chat once we get going to minimize disruptions. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker and panelists for today. Peter DeCure, TPB Chair, Tariq Kumar, our Director of Policy and Legislation, and Nadia Harris, our Senior Policy Advisor. Welcome, Peter. Over to you to start us off.
Thanks, Ashley, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third instalment of our Code Determination webinar series. If you have missed the first two, you can access these sessions as recordings via YouTube, and we'll send you the links later in today's session. To get started, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there has been a lot of questions and some concerns raised around the reform packages. Hopefully today we'll be able to clear up some aspects of that for you, and I'm sure that watching the previous webinars will assist in that as well. First of all, I think it's important to know that these changes are not intended to be a punishment for the people who have always been doing the right thing. And I think by implementing a few changes in your existing practices, you'll be able to have a much improved and safer practice for yourselves as well as for your clients. I would stress that the additional requirements are consistent with the existing obligations under the Code and the Taxation Services Act, and really give a little bit more specificity to what is expected of tax practitioners and how to best comply with your obligations. The other thing I will say is that these requirements largely mirror the professional standards that are endorsed by the Australian Accounting Professional and Ethical Standards Board, the APES. These standards already apply to anybody who's a member of CPA Australia, Chartered Accountants Australia, New Zealand, and the Institute of Public Accountants. So to get started, I'd like to go over a little bit of background. And I'm sure there's a number of you who have already been online for the first two instalments of this webinar series. So this background is going to be similar and a little bit repetitive for you. So I apologise for that, but I think it is important for everybody who's online for the first time. It's important to understand that these obligations are built on, in the first instance, the recommendations of the 2019 James Review, which was an independent review of the operations of the Tax Practitioners Board as well as the effectiveness of the Taxation Services Act. So in 2019, the government accepted recommendation 5.1 from the James Review. It recommended that the minister be given the power to supplement the code to address the emerging or existing behaviours and practices within the tax profession. Then on the 6th of August 2023, the government announced a significant package of reforms intended to crack down on those who are engaged in misconduct and to help the legitimate practitioners to rebuild confidence in the system and to help keep our capital markets strong. These reforms also provide some increased powers for the TPB and other regulators to strengthen our existing regulatory framework. In January 24, the government introduced an additional obligation requiring practitioners to comply with the obligations under Section 30.10.12 of the Code. The provision particularly allows the Minister to act quickly by way of issuing a legislative instrument to expand the Code if there is new or emerging issues. However, the Minister is obliged to ensure that any additional obligations made relate to professional and ethical conduct and are consistent with the Code of Conduct itself in the TASA. The Minister has subsequently issued the first determination under this power, and it introduces 8 additional code obligations designed to reinforce the high professional and ethical standards of practitioners. So let's jump to the next slide. These new code obligations include upholding and promoting ethical standards of the tax profession, the requirements relating to false or misleading statements, managing conflicts of interest when undertaking activities for or with the government and maintaining confidentiality of dealings with government, obligations to keep proper client records and proper records of the tax agent services that you provide, obligations in relation to supervision, competency and quality management under the Tax Agent Services Act, which are the particular obligations that we will be talking about today, as well as keeping your clients informed of matters that are relevant to them. Importantly, these new obligations align with the existing 5 key principles in the Code. They also leverage material from the work of other existing bodies or other elements of the Code and build on well understood and well known concepts in corporate and taxation law. If we can go on to slide 8, we'll talk about the implementation and transition to these new approaches. So in the first instance, I want to make it clear that we do understand and have great empathy for the difference between large and small firms, and we will be implementing these requirements in a way that demonstrates that understanding. We don't expect small firms to necessarily implement the same systems or the same level of sophistication in their systems and processes as we do expect from large firms. But we do expect that all tax practitioners will have appropriate arrangements in place to make sure you're operating in a professional and ethical manner. How you meet the existing and new obligations will always need to be determined on a case-by-case basis, having regard to the individual circumstances and the facts. Consistent with our approach to our guidance relating to other obligations, we will set requirements that apply to all tax practitioners and will communicate that through our guidance. However, how a tax practitioner meets those obligations will vary depending on a number of facts, including your business model and the nature and size of your client base and the type of practice that you are engaged in. Now, just getting to the commencement of the new provisions, the new code obligations commence on 1 July 2025 for tax practitioners with 100 or less employees, and that is counted at 31 July 2024. This includes new practitioners with 100 or less employees that registered in the period between 1 August 2024 and 30 June 2025 inclusive. The new obligations come into force for any other tax practitioner on 1 January 2025. And for the avoidance of doubt, that's for practitioners with 100 or more employees. Let's move on and start talking about the consultation process. To support the implementation, we have engaged with a number of stakeholders, including the professional associations, community representatives, to try and develop practical guidance and to distribute that into the profession. We've now reached the stage where we can go to slide 10, where we have released our draft information sheets for public consultation, and our aim is to finalise our guidance in December this year. So what we're seeking now is for you to provide any feedback that you have in relation to the shape and the concepts as they're discussed in our guidance. If you want to provide us with your feedback, we'd be grateful to receive it by the 21st of November, and it can be submitted to tpb.submissions@tpb.gov.au. And on receipt, we'll consider all of that feedback before we finalise our guidance. In terms of this process, we're committed to supporting you through this process and to try and get the most practical and useful and easily understood guidance for you. So if you'd like to provide any feedback, please do so. We are aware that a number of these reforms have taken effect in recent times and that there is a high workload for you to get your head around it. So what we're trying to do is make sure that our guidance is useful and immediately implementable by you. Very keen to support you, those of you who are genuinely trying to do the right thing, and this includes providing a reasonable time for you to understand your obligations, to assess your practices, and to implement the changes that are required. And as I've said, we'll talk a little bit later about how we plan to implement and really what you will see from your end. While you implement these changes, you won't see a great deal of change in the way we do things, because for those practitioners that aren't doing the right thing, when we receive complaints or referrals, we look into those, but we won't be sending inspectors out to you to see if you've already implemented these new changes. What we'll be doing is considering the compliance of those people who aren't doing the right thing with these changes when we determine whether there is an appropriate sanction to be implemented when we've discovered poor behaviour. So let's move on and take a look at the competence requirements under section 35. On slide 12, please. The new competence obligations in section 35 really are to provide a little bit of extra specificity to what's already in the TASA that you're already familiar with, including concepts like sufficient number and supervisory arrangements. So the code determination extends these obligations to ensure that an entity providing tax or BAS agent services on your behalf maintains knowledge and skills relevant to the tax agent services provided and is appropriately supervised, having regard to the knowledge, skills of the entity for the tax agent services provided and their system of quality management. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I want to confirm that the definition of entity includes a natural person. So what we're talking about here is the staff in a tax agent or BAS agent practice. We're talking about contractors that a tax agent or BAS agent might use. We're talking about outsourced arrangements where a tax or BAS agent might outsource work to another party. In particular, I would confirm that these arrangements definitely apply to those sort of offshoring arrangements that have become more normal business over recent years. So when we talk about appropriate supervision and control, what we're talking about is making sure that there is sufficient supervision to ensure that people are properly trained, that they have the right level of skills and knowledge, and both as individuals and within the entity, so that we can be sure that the tax agent and BAS agent services are provided professionally and with the requisite level of skill. So this will include making sure that there are, in fact, adequate levels of professional education and training for the services that people provide. And I would stress that, in a small practice or a more general practice, that wouldn't necessarily mean that people are fully trained in every aspect of tax. You might never be required to give transfer pricing or international tax advice. So what we're looking for is to make sure that people are appropriately skilled and trained for the nature of the work that they're doing in their tax or BAS agent practice. And as you'll know, also a critical part of adequate supervision, control, and tax agent services is to make sure that you are keeping adequate records that correctly record the tax agent services that you've provided or that are provided on your behalf to clients. And we did talk about that in webinar 2 in some more detail. So I'd like to move on now and talk about at slide 13, what is a competent standard? So let's try and break it down. Competence with respect to tax practitioners and those who provide tax agent or BAS agent services can be defined as a state of being capable, fitting, and suitably sufficiently qualified to provide the BAS or tax agent service that you are providing to a genuine professional and ethical standard. So again, just stressing, we're talking about making sure that the entity, the tax service, the tax agent practice, the individuals who are working in it, the tax practitioner, the registered practitioner, or the supervising agent has the right level of skills to fulfill their part of the provision of the tax services. For an entity, this definitely means that you have to meet the sufficient number of registered individual agents to supervise the practice, and it definitely means that those supervising agents should be adequately trained, qualified, and up-to-date CPE to deliver the type and standard of services that their practice is delivering. Genuinely, the purpose of this is to ensure that the services that are being provided are provided competently and at the standard required by the clients, being the taxpayers. We're often asked the question is, what does it mean to make up the sufficient number for adequate supervision? Now, there's no precise definition of what adequate supervision is, but what we do is we look at the specific facts of any individual case, and it needs to be clear that in relation to the amount of work, the number of staff, the number of clients, the complexity of the clients or the size of the clients, that there's enough time for the supervising agent to adequately be across the work that's being provided in their practice so that you can demonstrate that there is sufficient supervision and control. And that can be done both via individual working face-to-face, hand-to-hand with each other, can also be done through appropriate controls and processes and procedures within the practice in terms of review of work, sign off of work, and those sort of things. But we do need to ensure that there is adequate supervision and control. So we're going to have a quick look at a case study scenario to talk about some of the facts we consider. So in this instance, as you can see, Gabby's a registered BAS agent. She's the sole director and supervising agent of a BAS agent company. She employs 10 staff to undertake BAS services on behalf of the company, 2 of whom are graduates with less than 6 months' experience. 1 has 5 years' experience, and 3 others each have 2 years' experience. Gabby is the nominated sole supervising agent for 3 other unrelated entities. Gabby's personal BAS agent company has 50 small businesses, each with an annual turnover of less than 2 million. The unrelated entities' client bases include mostly medium enterprises with annual turnovers between $10 and $100 million, and some of which have more complex tax affairs. The unrelated entities each have approximately 150 clients each. So let's, if you want to take a minute to consider this scenario, I'd like to ask you if you think Gabby has adequate or appropriate supervisory arrangements in place. Think about the number and experience of her employees, the client base, and the complexity of their affairs. Give us a thumbs up on the screen if you think she has met the requirements, or a thumbs down if you think she hasn't. There's a good number of emojis coming through, from the thumbs up to the shocked face, and even a party emoji coming through. So, not sure about the party. There's a couple of couple rolling on the floor laughing. I think it looks like a pretty even spread, but probably leaning towards inadequate supervision. I think we're from our perspective, we're probably talking about a set of circumstances where we're unlikely to be satisfied that there is an adequate level of supervision and control here. And what I would point to is that Gabby's supervising as a sole agent, about 500 entities work. She's doing it through four separate practices and covering some organisations that are small and some organisations that are large and complex. And unless we had a bit more information about Gabby using a lot of very sophisticated controls and procedures to provide this supervision, it's hard to get my head around the idea that she's actually got a full understanding of the quality and competence of all of the services being provided by all of those people who are providing services in those entities. So I think we're probably at a point where we would need Gabby to demonstrate to us quite clearly how it is that she thinks that she's providing adequate supervision and control in these circumstances. I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge here is that it's probably easier to provide supervision and control when you're working face to face with people, when you're working remotely with people in various locations, which clearly Gabby is doing. It might be quite hard to satisfy that you really are on top of everything to the extent that you need to be. So having dealt with that, let's jump into the quality management systems requirements under the new Section 40. And I'll run through the requirements, and then we'll spend a little bit of time answering some of your questions. So on the next slide, please, as you can see, quality management systems under Section 40, a tax practitioner must establish and maintain a system of quality management in relation to the tax or BAS agent services provided. With reasonable confidence, you are complying with the code, and you must document and enforce policies and procedures of your system, which include the dot points below: governance and leadership, monitoring of performance, adherence to the code, client engagement, proper record keeping, proper confidentiality, management of conflicts, recruitment, training, and management of employees. So I think the topics are reasonably able to be understood. What I'd like to say now is that the extent of internal controls and systems in place are going to differ really materially between tax practitioners. And our view of this will be based on looking at the size of the individual practices, the level of the day-to-day hands-on engagement by the tax practitioner on whose behalf the services are provided, and the complexity of the services being provided, as well as the complexity of the client's tax affairs. So complying with this code obligation is designed to give consumers confidence that their practitioners have appropriate policies, systems, and processes to ensure that services provided are of a high professional standard. So let's firstly have a look at how this might work in a larger firm. So in a larger firm, we expect a reasonably high level of sophistication in terms of internal controls and systems. In particular, we would expect that there are regular staff training on all tax matters, including the requirements of the Taxation Services Act and the Code. We would expect that there'd be information barriers for conflicts of interest. So to make sure that there are processes and procedures that actively manage conflicts of interest within your practice. We would expect that there are quality management systems within and processes within your practice to ensure the accuracy and standard of tax agent services being provided. And this really does cover off on simple things like making sure that there's a proper review process for work done by junior staff, that the reviews are done by people who are adequately qualified, that there's appropriate use of checklists and guidance to make sure that those services are provided properly. there should be proper authorization and risk management processes that consider things like potential conflicts of interest prior to accepting new clients. There should also be systems that manage the genuine level of tax risk within the client base that you're working with. We would expect there are appropriate file management systems to ensure that files are able to be properly managed, that there are access controls to make sure that people who have no business to access private information don't access that information. And there should be limited access to confidential information, and there should be, clear policies and procedures as to how you protect the security of things like tax file numbers. We also think that there should be documented reporting lines and responsibilities within the practice so that we know how the practice meets its obligations. And I will stress that it's the tax agent, be it the individual tax agent or the tax agent company or partnership, that is responsible for the services that are provided. So if there's poor behaviour amongst your staff, it's the agent who is responsible for that poor behaviour. So these requirements are designed to assist you in managing your own risk. We also would recommend that from time to time there are appropriate independent reviews of internal controls to make sure that you've got enough assurance that what you are doing is up to scratch. So that's for a large practitioner. I'd now like to talk through an example of an individual or a small practitioner on the next slide. Thank you. So obviously, and I know there's been quite a bit of concern about what does this requirement mean for a small practitioner. But what I'd like to say is that, what we would expect for an individual is to make sure that there's adequate physical control over confidential information. And that's, simple things like having physical controls over filing cabinets or filing rooms, that you've got adequate, security over your premises, that you've got adequate cyber security arrangements, and it's relatively simple to use things like two-factor authentication when people sign onto systems these days. And we would expect an individual practitioner to do what's adequate to protect the information that is clearly confidential. We also expect individual practitioners to have a process in place to make sure that they comply with conflict of interest obligations before engaging a client. We expect them to be able to demonstrate that they've complied with proof of identity obligations that are existing obligations, and we've had multiple education webinars and guidance on that subject. So that's about making sure that you've proven the identity of your clients adequately before engaging with them, and you all know that the rules allow you to have well-known clients over the years. So it's about making sure that you've got a procedure in place. We also think it's really important that you regularly updating your software and information controls. The latest versions of the software that you use have the best security. So we would expect you to do those things. We would also expect you as an individual to be able to demonstrate that you've done your own CPE up to the required standards, and that you are providing adequate CPE for any staff that are in your practice to do the job that they're in your practice to do. As I said before, we don't need everybody in the practice to be trained up to the highest possible standard. We need them to be properly trained for the job that they're doing for you in your practice. So let's jump across to the next slide and just talk a little bit about policies and procedures. As I've said, organisational policies and procedures include things like recruitment, to make sure that the people that you are recruiting are fit and proper people to be in the job, so that they don't have criminal records, that they have any qualifications that they represent to you that they really have got. Normal things in a recruitment process. We think you should be looking at things like training, information, how information is shared through your practice, how you report to your clients, what your record keeping policies and procedures are, what security you have over your filing system, both physical and cyber security, using the right information technology for the circumstances, how you deal with complaints and how you deal with workplace culture. All of those things, I think, are critical parts of a good system of quality management and control. And as you can see, the bigger you get, the more sophisticated those systems should be. So let's jump forward and we'll have a look at another case study scenario about uh, these issues. So, Prepare to Lodge is a small medium tax agent company employing registered tax agents and employees who are not registered. They maintain a sufficient number and last reviewed and updated its quality management policies and procedures 5 years ago. In brackets, they're probably now out of date. Prepare and Lodge expects their tax agents to complete relevant professional education activities from external providers uh, in their own time and at their own expense. They also don't conduct any internal audit or review to assess the effectiveness of any of their controls. So let's have a bit of a think. What do you think about that scenario? Give us a thumbs up if you think they're adequate, or a thumbs down if you don't. There's not many approving of this one, and I think it really, in terms of the next slide, we've got the outcome of this. I think everybody's pretty on top of this. Can we just, yeah, thank you. In these circumstances, the TP would be unlikely to be satisfied that Prepare to Lodge is meeting their obligations. In the first instance, maintaining your policies and procedures means, regular review and keeping them up to date. And I would have thought, 5 years is too long. I would have thought, a review and sign off every 2 years at least would be more likely to meet our obligations. We need you to actively enforce your expectations that your agent completes CPE or that your team completes relevant CPE. That doesn't just mean that you say we expect you to do it. It means you should be keeping some records. You should be asking your team what they're doing. And genuinely, I think a really good practice would give some assistance in making sure that appropriate training and CPE is provided to their team. And we also think that there needs to be an appropriate training program, even for your administrative staff in your practice, because if you've got people working in a tax practice who aren't tax or BAS agents, they still need to have a basic understanding of the confidentiality, privacy, and conflict of interest rules to make sure that the whole business is running in the right level. So on that note, I think I'd like to hand it back to Julie now, and we'll go through a few questions with the assistance of Tariq and Nadia.
Thank you so much, Peter. So yeah, Tariq and Nadia would like to join us. We'll go through some of the questions that we've received during the session. I just wanted to let everyone know that we've also turned the chat back on now. So if you wanted to put any commentary in the chat that you can chat amongst yourselves, please do so. So I might go, Nadia, to you to begin the questions. And I've got a question here asking about, do clients have the right to expect that any tax advice provided by a tax agent practice is prepared by or signed off by a tax agent?
Yeah, okay, good question. And I guess the short answer is yes, they do have the right to expect that if they're engaging a firm to provide tax agent services, that those services are at least going to be supervised or signed off by a registered tax practitioner. How that will look for every firm, of course, will be different, but essentially it will be the responsibility of the tax practitioner within the practice to ensure that those services are provided appropriately and in accordance with the standards.
Great, thank you for that. Tariq, I'll bring you into the chat now as well. And I've got a question here from Christos. They're asking, how do we supervise work done by offshore contractors and maintain confidentiality of the client records?
Yeah, sure, Julie. Thank you, Christos, for that question. In terms of offshoring, the first thing you would need to look at is the confidentiality issue. Obviously, you have an obligation to keep your clients' details confidential. So if you're going to be disclosing them to another party, including offshore, then you have to seek your client's permission and consent for that. In terms of how you'd actually go about supervising that work that's completed offshore, you'd need some processes in place depending on how many people are doing that work offshore, in terms of, will you be sending another person there to physically supervise? Are you remotely supervising? Then how so? What sort of systems and processes do you have to ensure the quality of that work, basically?
Fantastic. Thanks for clarifying that. Nadia, I've got a question here that you flagged in the chat as well. And this
Before you
one
go on,
is,
can I just add
oh yeah, sorry.
to what Tariq was saying there? I think it's really important when we're offshoring. The people who work in the offshore environment need to be properly trained in Australian tax law. So it's your obligation as an agent to make sure that you've done enough to ensure, one, that they have the competence to do the work that's required of them. Two, that you review enough of their work to see that they are making the right decisions in terms of how the work is completed. And three, that there is ongoing, as Tariq has said, ongoing systems. But it is, because the work's being provided on your behalf as the agent, it is your responsibility to do those things.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so Nadia, back to you. Just asking here, is there a template available to ensure that the quality management manual meets all of the code requirements?
Yeah, good question, and I'm going to give you an answer that you won't like, probably. We don't have templates. It's the TPB's practice not to provide templates, the same as with letters of engagement and that sort of thing. That's really just representative of the fact that every practitioner, every firm, every client base is so different, and it is a little bit dangerous from our perspective to be providing templates and then practitioners thinking, well, I've got the TPB's endorsed approach and I'm not going to use my professional judgment and turn my mind to anything and just go with that. So no, we don't. Professional bodies may, but we just do really warn you to please make sure it's fit for your purpose if you are using templates, just to make sure that it's not a tick and flick kind of situation.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Peter, I've got a question here about competency, and this one's asking, do the new requirements around staff providing services competently require tax practitioners to have formal training processes in place for their staff?
And this is really building on what Nadia has just said. In your practice, you need to make sure that people have enough competency to do the job that you're asking them to do in the practice. So I think that the first step for that is, if you bring in your staff, you should understand that the qualifications and prior experience that they bring to your organisation is real, and you need to work with them in the first instance, through monitoring and supervising their work, to understand what level of competence they really do have in the job that they're doing. And I think, as I've said earlier, there should be regular training for all of your staff, including your admin staff. The training should include, at least once a year, updates on the TASA and the code of conduct and how it's implemented, to make sure that everybody in your firm is aware of their obligations and the firm's obligations to the TASA and the code. And it should also include, proper training for the pieces of work they're doing. Now, if you've got somebody that's in there doing BAS work for small business, they should be trained to do that. If they suddenly want them to branch out into doing BAS work for super funds, there might be some add-on training, because what's going on in the super fund and the requirements there are a little bit different to what's going on in a small business per se. So just making sure that people have got adequate skills and training to do the job they're supposed to do, and that doesn't mean that they have to have as much skill or training as a registered agent.
Great, thanks, Peter. I've got a question now from Farah, and Farah's asking, when it talks about having appropriate record keeping, does it mean that a tax practitioner has to ask a business for every single receipt before doing their bookkeeping and preparing any of their tax matters?
Thanks, Julie. And as I said, we worked through this in webinar number 2 in some detail, so I'd encourage you to go back and watch the recording of that. But I do want to make it clear that what we're talking about is not duplicating the client's records. We understand that agents and BAS agents often work live online with their clients' general ledgers and things. So we're not asking you to keep a copy of general ledgers. We're not asking you to keep copies of receipts and those sort of things. What we are asking you to do is to maintain a file that properly records what you've done in terms of providing a tax agent service. So, for instance, if you're providing a particular piece of advice, you should have a copy of the advice. You should have copies or reference notes to any tax rulings that you might have considered, any tax cases or any research that you've done. And that will demonstrate that you've done that work. For a tax return or a BAS return, you should have copies of the returns and copies of the working papers that you used to complete those returns. Copies of things like engagement letters, transmittal letters with the client or correspondence with the client about the issues. That all demonstrates that you've done your job professionally and provides that appropriate, audit trail, as you might say, for the adequacy and professionalism of your work.
Thank you. The next question I've got here is about bankruptcy, and the person's asking, how do you ask someone during an interview if they are bankrupt? Have you got any advice on that?
Look, regrettably, Julie, I think you just have to be upfront with it. You have in an agent's practice, you do have obligations to meet the rules in relation to disqualified entities. So in terms of how you frame the question, I think it's fair to say to the person that because you're being interviewed for this role within a tax practice, we are obliged to deal with the disqualified entity rules. So unfortunately or regrettably, I am obligated to ask you this question to fulfill our professional responsibilities, and just attack it something like that.
Thanks, Peter. Nadi, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think there were quite a flurry of comments or questions in the chat box. I think, Peter, when you mentioned recruitment, and people asking, do we need to conduct police checks on every employee? I would just encourage anyone who's not sure to have a look at our disqualified entity guidance. It's a really good starting point about what is expected. It talks about those people who are involved in the provision of tax agent services. So what's appropriate in terms of onboarding for someone who's actually involved in providing tax agent services is of course going to be different to someone who is perhaps undertaking more low risk work within the practice. So there is a difference there. And there's also a checklist you can actually work through with a prospective employee and have them sign and declare that what they've told you is all true and correct. So it's a really good starting point for you to use. And I think it will take a lot of guesswork out of recruitment processes for practitioners. So do have a look at that on our website. We do have webinars on disqualified entities as well, which might help.
Excellent. Thanks, Nadia.
I do think, just to emphasise, a tax practice, an accounting practice, a financial planning practice, a BAS agent practice, these are data-rich environments where there's a lot of confidential private financial information. So you are at quite considerable risk of having people trying to join you for the wrong reason or trying to gain access to your systems for the wrong reasons.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's a good segue to my next question from Sarah, and she's asking about cybersecurity, and she wants to know, is this a must for tax practitioners?
Julie, absolutely. Cybersecurity is a really important part of any tax practice, and I think you'll remember we've done webinars on this subject in the past. We've tried to make it very clear to all tax practitioners that doing education and training in relation to cybersecurity is eligible CPE in terms of meeting your obligations for CPE for the TPB, for your registration. It's a critical part of maintaining your professional obligations in relation to privacy, in relation to security of clients' information. And it is, it's very much something that we need all practitioners to take responsibility for.
Thanks, Peter.
I'll just add to that, Julie.
Sure.
That's a very good point around confidentiality as well. There's the obligations under the code and our code guidance on confidentiality. If you have a look at that on the website, talks about cybersecurity and, taking that into account.
Excellent. And I'll just add as well that we did do a cyber webinar, as Peter sort of alluded to, a couple of months ago. So that's on our YouTube channel. So highly encourage you to have a look at that. We had our Chief Technology Officer, Craig, on board, and he gave some really good advice on some tips and hints that you can use in your practice. So the next question I've got is going back to offshoring, and this one's asking, do overseas staff providing admin services like invoicing need to be trained as well?
Invoicing is not necessarily a tax agent or a BAS agent service, so the requirements might not apply directly to them. But what I would say is I think, these principles are really good in terms of protecting yourself and your own professional reputation. So as I said, I think it's appropriate for people to be trained to adequately do the job that they do. And if they're using your client's private information, confidential information, it should at least it should be made clear to these people what our obligations to privacy and confidentiality are. So I think it's a graduated level.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions in the chat about engagement letters. So first of all, should all individual clients be signing an engagement letter every year? And then secondly, should BAS agents be using engagement letters as well?
I reckon Nadia is good on engagement letters.
My favorite topic. The answer is yes, you should be using engagement letters. We recommend at least annually. It can be more depending on what you're doing with the client, whether the circumstances have changed. Engagement letters are great. They're great for a range of reasons, and they're great for even non-TPB reasons. Having a clear set of understanding terms, conditions, outlining exactly what you expect of your client and what they can expect of you is really helpful tool. We see a lot of complaints come in at the TPB that we don't necessarily have jurisdiction over, but there'll be complaints about fee disputes or about scope of work where there is a disconnect between what the tax practitioner expected and what the client expected. And usually when there are these issues, it's because there is no clear engagement letter at the outset setting out these expectations. So just again, yes, we do recommend it. We at least annually is what you should be aiming for. But just as a matter of practice, I think it does save headaches down the road.
And probably just add to that, Julie, that that's another topic that we do have a publication on, and it talks about the benefits, the importance of engagement letters, and some of the things that they could usefully include. So please have a look at that on our website.
Thank you both for that. Tariq, I might go back to the sufficient number requirement now, and I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit more information on who can form the sufficient number.
Yeah, sure, Julie. So the sufficient number can really be anyone within the practice. So, for example, if you're a partnership or a company tax agent, it may normally include partners or directors, but it could also include people that are not partners and directors, so just normal employees, contractors, anyone that's providing services on your behalf can form that sufficient number. So there's no real restriction there.
Great, thank you for that.
The people who form the sufficient number have to be registered agents or registered BAS agents in relation to BAS agent services.
Great, thank you for that. Peter, I've got your favourite question here again for you. We've talked about the pragmatic approach that we'll be taking to enforcing the obligations and giving people time to get their compliance measures in place. Could you just give us a bit more information on what we mean exactly by that?
Sure, thanks, Julie. And I think really, importantly, in the first instance, we're going through this process of getting our guidance finalised and right. So today's webinar and this series of webinars are about talking to agents, both to explain where we're up to and how we're thinking, also to invite feedback from agents and from the public about the guidance itself. The next step is to finalise that guidance, hopefully in mid-December, and then it will be there, able to be used in its final form for any of the larger firms to whom these obligations apply from 1 July, but also provide that extra 6-month window for the smaller firms. So from 1 January for the larger firms, 6-month window for the smaller firms to get their head around these new requirements before 1 July. And as I said, there's not, when the application date hits, it's not that the TPB will be sending investigators out into practices to check whether you have got these things implemented. what happens in our processes is where we get complaints from the public or referrals from the ATO or other intelligence, we might do some investigative work to decide whether an agent is demonstrating poor behaviour. If that preliminary work suggests we should do an investigation, then we go on to a full investigation. And, if there's the other sort of more normal poor behaviour, not providing clients refunds, excessive claims or inappropriate claims, potentially tax promoter type activity, tax schemes or inappropriate advice, we'll look deeper, but it'll be those really poor behaviours where there'll be sanctions imposed. Now, these new requirements are going to inform us better when we get to that imposing sanctions piece. So if we've got a practice that's doing the wrong thing in terms of consistently overclaiming work-related deductions or consistently using R&D schemes or something like that, if you've also got no quality management system, you've got no competence within your staff, you're not doing enough CPE, we can sit there. There's this whole raft of things that we can now say, well, if you'd done all of these things, you probably would have got to the right outcome. So that's going to help us in determining the right level of sanction for those practitioners who are behaving poorly. And I really do want to stress that for the vast majority of you who are doing the right thing time and time again, doing it the right way, you'll probably never hear from us because you won't be getting referrals or complaints made about you. For the minor matters, it'll probably just be like a phone call with some of our staff to ask you, well, why did you do this? And you can explain it so you move on. Or perhaps if you can't explain it, well, they say, well, can you change your ways a bit and we can move on. It's really for that, significant poor behaviour that this is really going to impact on people.
Thank you for that, Peter. I've had a few people in the chat asking about offshoring again, and I think probably one of the most predominant questions there is, do we have to inform our clients if we are offshoring some work?
So I want to reiterate what Tariq said originally. Your privacy and confidentiality obligations under the code mean that if you are going to disclose any information given to you by your clients to a third party, and an outsourcer will be a third party, if you're going to disclose that information, you must have your client's permission to do so before you make the disclosure. We suggest very strongly that permission should come in writing so that you've got evidence that you are passing information on with their consent. If you haven't got that consent in advance, you will be in breach of your obligations under the code.
Thank you. I've got a question from Sarah just in relation to the types of records that should be kept. Is it okay to keep a soft copy of records, including communications and phone calls, that type of thing?
Soft copies are fine. The obligation to keep records is that they be kept in the English language or easily convertible to the English language and readily retrievable. So soft copies are fine.
Excellent. And just to clarify for Dominique, Peter, it's 5 years that records need to be retained. Is that correct?
5 years from the date of providing the service, yes. And as Dominique will understand, that lines up with the client's obligations in relation to their own tax records.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think I've probably got time for maybe one or two more questions. This one is going back again to the sufficient number. It's sort of asking, we spoke about there not being a formula to determine the sufficient number. So if that's the case, is there any suggestions on how a practitioner can consider whether or not they do have a sufficient number in place? Nadia or Tariq, do you want to take that one or?
Yeah, I can jump in there, Julie. The obligation really rests with the tax practitioner. The onus is on the tax practitioner to assess their own practice because every practice will be different and, come up with an idea of how they're going to supervise all the services that will be provided on behalf of that practitioner. So, for example, if you've got a small firm, they're all located in the one office, there's only a handful of people providing services for that firm, you might be able to demonstrate that just one individual needs to be there for the purposes of the sufficient number. On the other hand, if you're a bigger firm over multiple locations and many, many staff, you're not going to be able to reasonably show that, even one or two, three people are going to be able to supervise all those services. So you really have to look at the size of your firm, the clientele, the locations you're in, the complexity of services provided, and then make a judgment call as to how many people you need to supervise all those services that are being provided to your client.
Excellent. Thanks, Tariq. I might just ask one more question and then I'll go back to each of you just to sort of sum up and give us a takeaway for today. So the last one is just asking if we could give some more details on client complaints process, what we need to have in place there.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think the TPB's published a fact sheet on keeping your client informed, which I think really does cover off all of those things in some detail. And if you can get the fact sheet on our website, if you use that fact sheet, you can actually give that to your clients, and that's going to help you to satisfy. But what they really need to know is that, the TPB's here, that there is a complaints process. It can be done by phone or online, and that they can contact us if they've got a problem with the services the agent provides. Now, that's all they really need to know, but the information sheet's there to help you. You can hand that out to your clients or put it on your website, or, make it easy, part of an attachment to the engagement letter. So that is a resource that we've provided for you.
Excellent. Thank you. Nadia, I'll go to you first. Is there anything you'd like to finish off with today?
I guess just on reflection with these two obligations that we spoke about today, I think, when we look at obligations under the code and the tassel, we're always sort of concerned and predominantly concerned with consumers and clients and ensuring that they are protected. These obligations, of course, they do that, but they also really are aimed at protecting you, the registered tax practitioner, as well, particularly in those circumstances where you do have other staff and employees and entities providing services on your behalf. So everyone online would know how difficult it is to become a registered tax practitioner. The qualification requirements are high. The ongoing experience requirements are significant. And so, they're set at that standard for a reason. So if you are engaging those people who are not necessarily registered or do not have the same skills and training that you have, you just need to ensure that you are protected and that your clients are also protected.
Fantastic advice. Thanks, Nadia. Tariq, did you have anything you'd like to close with?
Yeah, sure, Julie. The two obligations that Peter has spoken about today, they are obligations which we have put out a paper on and we're seeking consultation on. So this is really your chance to have a look at that document, read it, understand it. If you've got questions or feedback, it's open for public consultation. So please provide your comments. And, this is an opportunity for registered tax practitioners and our stakeholders to really shape the guidance that will support these obligations.
Thanks, Tariq. It'll be great to hear that feedback. Thank you. And Peter, I'll leave it to you to close off.
Nadia and Tariq have pretty much covered off, but the thing I really want to emphasise, for each of you, your circumstances are different. The size and complexity of your tax or BAS agent practices are different. So please genuinely understand that the guidance is there to help you. Whatever you can help us with to get it more appropriate for you is valued. But please implement with the spirit that you know your own practice best. So modify to the size and complexity of your practice, and think of it as a way to make sure that your business and your own practice and your own livelihood is really well protected, both in terms of helping you with potential PI claims, but also helping you with potential complaints from clients. And the vast majority of you are doing the right thing, and you're not going to have any difficulty with the TPB when you're genuinely trying to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And just to finish up, I'll give some information on how to stay in touch with us. So if you would like some more information and to keep up to date, jump onto our website at tpb.gov.au. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook and X. The details are there on the slide for you. And I also would encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. As we've said, we do have a lot of recordings from our previous webinars. You'll find them there and you can view them at your leisure and also still claim continuing professional education as well. Just wanted to say a big thank you to Peter and to Tariq and to Nadia for sharing your amazing insights with us today. I think it's been a really beneficial session. And as always, you can claim your continuing professional education for attending today's session. Just to finish up, as well, we're just going to be launching an exit survey and it's very quick, just takes 1 moment of your time. It's really helpful for us if you could complete it. It just gives us some ideas on what we can improve on and also any topics that might be of interest to you. So let us know that. It will just pop up in your browser when you leave the webinar today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you have found it beneficial today and we will hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.